On the evening of March 28, 1945, as the sun set behind the ruins of Western Germany, General George S. Patton stood at the edge of one of the fastest advances any American army had ever made. His Third Army had crossed the Rhine, smashed through weakened German defenses, and was moving east at a pace that stunned even seasoned Allied commanders. Patton believed the road ahead was open. Germany was collapsing. Resistance was fragmenting. In his mind, there was no reason to slow down. Yet within hours, orders arrived that would abruptly change the course of his advance. The directive did not come from Eisenhower, it came from General Omar Bradley. Bradley's order was clear and deeply frustrating to Patton. Halt the eastward thrust. Secure flanks. Do not outrun supporting forces. Do not push deeper into Germany without coordination. For Patton, the decision made no sense. The enemy was reeling. Speed had become the decisive weapon. Every mile gained reduced Germany's ability to regroup. To slow now, Patton believed, was to hand the enemy time they no longer deserved. But Bradley saw the situation differently, and his reasoning was shaped not by ambition but by memory. By early 1945, Bradley had lived through enough hard lessons to understand how quickly momentum could turn into disaster. He had watched bold advances collapse when supply lines stretched too thin. He had seen overextended units become vulnerable to counterattack. Most importantly, he had witnessed the consequences of commanders pushing too far ahead of the broader Allied plan. For Bradley, Patton's brilliance was undeniable, but so was his recklessness. The roots of Bradley's decision stretched back months earlier, to the autumn of 1944. During the rapid advance across France, Patton's Third Army had raced forward faster than supply networks could sustain. Fuel shortages had forced abrupt halts. Units sat idle within striking distance of key objectives, unable to move because logistics had been ignored in favor of speed. Bradley had been the one forced to manage the fallout. He admired Patton's aggression, but he also bore responsibility for ensuring the entire American front remained intact. That responsibility weighed heavily in March 1945. By then, the Allied command structure was under immense pressure. Germany was clearly losing, but the war was not yet over. Millions of German soldiers were still under arms. Entire armies had not surrendered. Intelligence reports warned of possible last-ditch defensive lines deeper inside Germany, particularly in Bavaria and the Alpine regions. There were concerns about fanatical resistance, guerrilla warfare, and the possibility that Nazi leadership might attempt to prolong the war through chaos rather than organized defense. Bradley understood that Patton's advance, if left unchecked, could create dangerous gaps. As Third Army surged eastward, neighboring units struggled to keep pace. Flanks stretched thin. Supply convoys struggled to navigate destroyed infrastructure. Bridges were damaged. Roads were clogged with refugees and retreating enemy forces. Speed created opportunity, but it also created exposure. On March 30, 1945, Bradley met with his staff to review the situation. Reports showed Patton spearheads advancing dozens of miles ahead of adjacent armies. In some sectors, American units were advancing faster than maps could be updated. Bradley recognized the pattern. This was the same scenario that had preceded disasters earlier in the war, only now it was happening deep inside enemy territory. Bradley's role as commander of the 12th Army Group demanded restraint. He was not tasked with glory or headlines. He was tasked with coordination. His responsibility was to ensure that Patton's success did not become a liability for the entire Allied effort. Eisenhower had made it clear that the final phase of the war required discipline, not improvisation. Patton, however, believed the opposite. He believed discipline at this stage meant relentless pressure. In his view, Germany's defenses were already shattered. Any pause would allow remnants to regroup. He argued that boldness now would save lives later. His diary entries from late March and early April reveal his frustration. He believed higher command lacked the nerve to finish the war decisively. Bradley read those same reports with a colder eye. He knew Patton was right about one thing: the German army was breaking. But Bradley also knew that wars were not ended by intuition alone. They were ended by coordination. The Allies had agreed on post-war boundaries. They had agreed on zones of occupation. They had agreed on who would take which objectives. A unilateral dash by Patton deep into Germany risked violating those agreements and complicating relations with the Soviet Union at the worst possible moment. This was not just a military decision, it was a political one. Bradley understood that allowing Patton to advance unchecked could place American forces in areas already promised to Soviet occupation. Such a move would not just anger Stalin, it could destabilize the fragile alliance holding the war together. Eisenhower had emphasized repeatedly that the goal was to defeat Germany, not to race allies for territory. On April 4, 1945, Bradley issued further instructions reinforcing the halt. Patton was to consolidate gains, eliminate remaining pockets of resistance, and prepare for coordinated advances rather than independent thrusts. The message was firm but carefully worded. Bradley did not accuse Patton of insubordination. He framed the decision as necessary for the broader success of the campaign. Patton received the order with barely concealed anger. He believed the war could be ended in weeks if he were allowed to continue. He saw Bradley's caution as weakness. Yet Patton obeyed, not because he agreed, but because he understood the chain of command. For all his bluster, Patton was a professional soldier. He would push boundaries, but he would not openly defy orders. As Third Army slowed, other Allied forces closed the gaps. Supply lines stabilized. German resistance continued to crumble, but now under controlled pressure rather than uncontrolled pursuit. Bradley watched closely, aware that history would judge whether his restraint had saved lives or prolonged the war. What neither man fully knew at the time was that this decision would define how their leadership was remembered. Patton would be remembered for speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. Bradley would be remembered for caution, coordination, and control. Their conflict in the spring of 1945 was not personal. It was philosophical, and it was far from over. In the days that followed Bradley's order to slow the advance, George Patton's frustration deepened into something closer to resentment. His Third Army was still fighting, still advancing in places, but the sense of momentum that had defined his command since Normandy had been deliberately restrained. For a man who believed speed was not just a tactic, but a philosophy, this felt like an unforgivable mistake. Patton recorded his anger privately. In his diary entries from early April 1945, he made no effort to hide his contempt for what he saw as excessive caution. He wrote that the Germans were beaten, that their resistance was collapsing faster than headquarters understood, and that every hour spent consolidating instead of advancing gave the enemy time to breathe. To Patton, the war was no longer about managing risks. It was about exploiting collapse. Yet even Patton understood that this was not solely Bradley's decision. Dwight D. Eisenhower loomed over the dispute, carefully balancing military necessity with political reality. Eisenhower admired Patton's effectiveness. He knew that no American commander moved faster or hit harder, but Eisenhower also carried a burden Patton did not. He was responsible not just for winning battles, but for holding together a fragile alliance at the very moment victory was approaching. By April 1945, Eisenhower's priorities had shifted decisively. The defeat of Germany was no longer in doubt. What mattered now was how that defeat occurred, who occupied which territories, and how the post-war order would be shaped. Eisenhower had already decided that Berlin was not worth a prolonged American push eastward. The city lay deep inside territory that would ultimately fall under Soviet control. Any attempt by American forces to seize it would come at enormous cost and risk direct confrontation with the Red Army. Bradley's order to restrain Patton must be understood in that context. The advance of Third Army threatened to outrun not just American logistics, but American strategy. As Patton pushed deeper into central Germany, his units approached regions earmarked for Soviet occupation. Allowing him to continue unchecked could have placed American forces in politically sensitive positions that Eisenhower was determined to avoid. On April 11, 1945, Eisenhower formally communicated his intent to focus Allied efforts on eliminating remaining German forces rather than racing for symbolic objectives. This message, circulated among senior commanders, reinforced Bradley's stance. Patton was to continue fighting, but within defined operational limits. There would be no independent dash for glory. The war would end on Eisenhower's terms, not Patton's instincts. Patton complied, but he did not accept the logic. He believed Eisenhower underestimated the psychological impact of relentless pressure. In Patton's view, wars ended when the enemy's will was crushed completely, not when lines on a map were respected. He feared that slowing down would allow fanatical elements to prolong resistance unnecessarily. Bradley, however, had his own fears. Intelligence reports warned of possible German attempts to regroup in the south, particularly in Bavaria and the Alpine regions. There were persistent rumors of a so-called National Redoubt, where Nazi leadership might retreat and attempt a last stand. While these fears would later prove exaggerated, they influenced Allied planning at the time. Bradley believed it was essential to eliminate these pockets methodically rather than gamble on a headlong rush. There was also the matter of casualties. Although German resistance was weakening, it had not vanished. Small, desperate units continued to fight fiercely in places. Bradley believed that reckless advances could expose American troops to unnecessary losses just days or weeks before the war's end. To him, restraint was not cowardice. It was responsibility. The contrast between Bradley and Patton was stark. Patton viewed caution as wasted opportunity. Bradley viewed speed as potential chaos. Both men were shaped by their experiences. Patton had thrived in fluid, aggressive campaigns. Bradley had learned to manage large formations, supply networks, and coalition politics. Their disagreement in 1945 was the inevitable collision of those perspectives. By mid-April, the consequences of Bradley's decision became visible. As Third Army consolidated, neighboring Allied forces caught up. Gaps closed, German units were enveloped rather than bypassed. Supply lines stabilized. The advance resumed, but now in a more controlled, deliberate fashion. The German army continued to disintegrate, but without the risks that had concerned Bradley. Patton never stopped believing the war could have ended sooner. Even after Germany's surrender on May 7, 1945, he remained convinced that greater boldness would have shortened the conflict and saved lives. Bradley, reflecting later, believed the opposite. He argued that discipline in the final weeks prevented unnecessary bloodshed and political complications that could have poisoned the post-war settlement. Their disagreement never fully healed. Patton would go on to criticize Allied policy toward the Soviet Union openly, further alienating himself from senior leadership. Bradley, by contrast, would rise steadily within the post-war military establishment, valued for his judgment, restraint, and ability to operate within complex political environments. The decision to halt Patton's advance into Germany thus became more than a tactical choice. It symbolized the transition from wartime improvisation to post-war calculation. It marked the moment when speed gave way to structure, when instinct yielded to coordination. And it set the stage for the final reckoning of how the war in Europe would truly end. By the final weeks of April 1945, the shape of the war in Europe was no longer defined by German resistance, but by Allied decisions. German armies were collapsing on all fronts. Cities fell with little fighting. Columns of prisoners streamed westward. What remained uncertain was not whether Germany would lose, but how the war would end and who would control the landscape left behind. Patton watched this unfold with growing impatience. His Third Army continued to advance, but always within boundaries imposed from above. Orders emphasized coordination, containment, and clearance rather than pursuit. To Patton, this was the wrong instinct at the wrong moment. He believed that the enemy was psychologically defeated, and that relentless pressure would prevent any organized resistance from forming in the final days. Bradley, overseeing the 12th Army Group, held firm. He had seen too many wars stumble at the finish line. He believed that victory demanded discipline, even more than aggression when the enemy was weakest. By slowing Patton's advance, Bradley ensured that German units were not merely bypassed but neutralized. Towns were secured, supply routes were protected. Allied lines remained continuous rather than fragmented. The German surrender on May 7, 1945, came sooner than many expected. Whether Patton's continued advance would have shortened the war by days or weeks remains a subject of debate. What is certain is that the war ended without the chaos that Bradley feared. There was no significant last stand in the Alps. No organized guerrilla resistance emerged. Allied forces entered Germany in a controlled manner, minimizing confusion and conflict with Soviet forces. Eisenhower viewed this outcome as validation of his strategy. He believed the war had ended efficiently and without unnecessary confrontation between allies. Bradley shared this assessment. Patton did not. In the aftermath, Patton became increasingly vocal in his criticism. He argued that the Allies had missed an opportunity to shape the post-war order more decisively. He believed the Soviets would not respect boundaries drawn on paper. He believed momentum should have been used to press further east while the opportunity existed. These views, controversial at the time, would later fuel debates about the early Cold War. Bradley, reflecting on the same period, emphasized restraint and responsibility. He believed that a victorious army had an obligation not just to defeat an enemy, but to prevent new conflicts from emerging immediately afterward. To him, stopping Patton was not an act of rivalry or fear, it was an act of stewardship. The contrast between the two men became symbolic of broader military philosophies. Patton represented the warrior who sought decisive action at all costs. Bradley represented the commander who balanced action with consequence. History would remember both, but not equally. Patton's reputation grew mythic. His speed, his speeches, his audacity captured the public imagination. Bradley's legacy was quieter. He was known as the general who managed complexity, who kept armies supplied, aligned, and effective. In the public memory, Patton became the face of American aggression. Bradley became the architect behind the scenes. The decision to halt Patton's advance into Germany encapsulated that difference. It was not a rejection of Patton's brilliance. It was an acknowledgement of its limits. Bradley did not stop Patton because he doubted his ability to win battles. He stopped him because winning the war required more than winning battles. As the dust settled in Europe, the Allied command structure dissolved, replaced by occupation authorities and political negotiations. Patton, restless and outspoken, struggled to adapt to the new reality. Bradley, pragmatic and disciplined, transitioned smoothly into post-war leadership. Their paths diverged, shaped in part by the decisions made in the spring of 1945. In retrospect, Bradley's choice reflects the central challenge of command at the end of a war. Knowing when to push harder is only half the equation. Knowing when to stop can be just as decisive. Bradley believed that stopping Patton preserved unity, reduced risk, and ensured a stable end to the conflict. Patton believed it cost the Allies a chance to finish the war on their terms. Both men were right in different ways, and the tension between their views continues to shape how historians interpret the final days of World War II in Europe.